Ben Johnson and the Chicago Bears front office are quietly obsessed with a rookie tight end most fans barely noticed on draft weekend, and once you see the tape, you're going to understand exactly why. Fave here, and today we're breaking down Sam Roush, the Bears' third-round pick out of Stanford, and why he might end up being one of the sneakiest valuable additions from this entire draft class, even sitting behind two more well-known names at his own position. Let's get into the film. First, the background, because this pick raised some eyebrows when it happened, and I want to address that honestly instead of pretending everybody loved it in the moment. Chicago already had Cole Kmet locked in as an established, productive starter, a guy who's already put together a genuinely strong body of work at the position, and they just spent a top 10 pick the year before on Colston Loveland, a player many analysts view as a future centerpiece of this passing offense. Spending a third-round selection, the 69th overall pick, on a third tight end when the roster clearly had bigger holes at left tackle and along the defensive front raised real questions among fans and analysts covering this team. Some evaluators pointed out directly that a contributing left tackle or a legitimate edge rusher would have made more traditional roster-building sense at that draft slot than a TE3. According to Pro Football Network's Jacob Infante, Chicago actually had the deepest star power at the position of any team in football once this pick was made, even if a team like the Rams technically had a deeper overall room by pure numbers. This wasn't a need pick in the traditional sense, and I don't think anybody in that draft room was pretending otherwise. This was Ben Johnson identifying a specific scheme fit and going and getting it, regardless of positional value discourse or what the roster construction charts said Chicago should have prioritized at that exact point in the draft. And that scheme fit is the whole story here, so let's actually dig into why Johnson values this specific archetype so heavily. Johnson leaned heavily on two tight end personnel groupings in his first season as Chicago's head coach, and according to that same PFN reporting, the Bears jumped from 19th in the league in that usage rate all the way up to 6th once Johnson took over play calling duties. That's not a marginal shift. That's a wholesale philosophical change in how this offense wanted to attack opposing defenses, moving away from spread it out, one tight end concepts and toward a heavier, more disguised approach. But it wasn't just 12 personnel with two tight ends. Johnson also used a real amount of 13 personnel last season, 3 tight ends on the field simultaneously, a grouping most NFL offenses barely touch anymore because it usually telegraphs a straightforward run play the second the defense sees it come out of the huddle. Defensive coordinators around the league have been trained for years now to treat heavy personnel as an automatic run signal. Sub and extra linebackers crowd the box and dare the offense to actually throw out of it. The problem for opposing defenses with Chicago's specific version of that package is that all 3 of their top tight ends can legitimately block and legitimately catch the football, which means the disguise actually works instead of just being window dressing. You can't just stack the box the second Roush trots onto the field alongside Loveland and Kmet, because all 3 are perfectly capable of running real routes out of the exact same personnel grouping that on paper looks like a run-heavy jumbo package. That's the entire value proposition of adding a third legitimate two-way tight end to a room that already had 2 good ones. It's not about needing bodies at the position. It's about making every single personnel grouping this offense trots out onto the field genuinely ambiguous to defend, forcing opposing coordinators to guess instead of react with confidence. Now let's actually get into what Roush brings to the table on tape, because I think the receiving profile gets undersold by people who just look at his box score numbers and move on to the next name on the board. His college production wasn't flashy, but it also wasn't empty, and I want to push back on the idea that he's purely a blocking specialist with nothing else to offer. He finished his final season at Stanford with 49 catches for 545 yards and 2 touchdowns, numbers that actually ranked 5th among all tight ends in the entire FBs in both receptions and receiving yardage. Think about that for a second. 5th in the country at his position in both major receiving categories at a school that wasn't exactly running a pass-heavy, tight end-friendly offensive system built to inflate those numbers artificially. He's not going to blow you away as a route runner working through a complex tree of option routes, and evaluators have pointed to arm length as a real, legitimate knock on his overall receiving ceiling at the next level, something that could limit his catch radius in contested situations. But he's got reliable hands. He's tough to bring down in the open field once he catches the ball, and he shows real physicality after the catch, breaking through arm tackles and picking up extra yardage that a lot of blocking profile tight ends simply leave on the table because they lack the functional athleticism to do anything after the catch beyond falling forward. This isn't a guy who's purely an inline body who can't be trusted with the football when the offense actually needs him to make a play. He's a legitimate, functional third option at the position who happens to have one elite standout trait that separates him from almost everybody else in this draft class. That trait is the blocking, and this is where the tape gets genuinely special. Genuinely worth your time slowing down and rewatching a few times. Roush profiled during the pre-draft process as one of the few true plug-and-play inline Y tight ends available in this entire class. A rare archetype in a league that's increasingly stocked with pass-catching first tight ends who struggle the moment you ask them to actually move a defensive lineman off the ball in a phone booth. Watch the way Stanford trusted him in combo blocking schemes throughout his college career. On zone runs, you'll see him make legitimate cutoff blocks, sealing defenders away from the play with real hand technique and real leverage instead of just getting in the way and hoping for the best. On gap scheme runs, the trust level gets even more impressive to watch develop over the course of a game. Stanford's coaching staff put him directly on interior defensive linemen in combo block situations, asking him to help displace bodies that outweigh him by 30, sometimes 40 pounds, and he consistently held his own against that kind of size mismatch. That's not something you ask a tight end to do unless you've already seen him succeed at it repeatedly in practice reps that never make it onto a scouting tape. You don't see that level of trust extended to many tight ends in this draft class, and it tells you everything about how Stanford's own coaching staff actually viewed him as a football player, not just a name on a depth chart. Go through the reps and you'll see the same pattern show up over and over across multiple games and multiple opponents. Pulling from left to right, working in combination with his center to climb to the second level and find a linebacker in space, while the play side tackle handles the edge defender on the perimeter. Then flip the exact same concept, pulling right to left instead. The same combo block mirrored on the other side of the formation, right guard working to the interior defensive lineman while the center climbs up to the second level. Both times in both directions, Roush holds his ground against defenders who have real size and real strength advantages on paper. He's not just getting in the way and hoping the running back finds a crease somewhere behind him. He's actually winning individual leverage battles against defensive linemen with his hand placement and his pad level, and functioning as a legitimate extra gap scheme blocker, the exact skill set that makes a coordinator's run game install more versatile instead of more predictable and easier to defend once film starts piling up on him. Here's why that specific trait matters so much for what Ben Johnson wants to build in Chicago, and I think this is the part that gets lost when people just dismiss this as a wasted pick at a stocked position. Picture this personnel grouping on the field together during a critical third and short situation, Loveland working the seam as a legitimate receiving mismatch that no linebacker in football wants to try covering one-on-one, Kmet handling his usual dual threat role as both a reliable blocker and a trusted target over the middle, and Roche lined up in line as a genuine extra gap scheme blocker who can also run a real route the moment the defense stops respecting him as a receiving threat. That's a 12 or 13 personnel grouping that forces a defensive coordinator into an impossible guessing game before the ball's even snapped. Do you play base personnel to handle the run threat and risk getting exposed if Loveland releases into a seam route against a linebacker who has no business trying to run with him down the field? Or do you play nickel to handle the passing threat and risk getting physically overwhelmed at the point of attack on a genuine downhill running play behind Roush in this offensive line? That's the exact tension good offensive coordinators spend their entire careers trying to manufacture, and Roush's specific blocking profile is what makes that tension real and weekly instead of theoretical and easily solved with a simple personnel substitution. There's also a longer-term angle here worth flagging honestly, and I think it's part of why the front office was comfortable spending real day two draft capital on a third player at an already stocked position group. Cole Kmet has publicly said he expects to be with the Bears this season and doesn't feel like he's going anywhere, telling reporters directly that his exit meeting conversations left him feeling like the organization values him and wants him around, and that Ryan Poles and Ben Johnson have been straightforward and honest with him throughout that process. And by all accounts, the front office has communicated the same thing directly to him behind closed doors. But Kmet is heading into a stretch of his career where his contract situation could become genuinely relevant in the next year or two as this roster continues to mature and other priorities compete for cap space. Roush profiles as exactly the kind of player who could eventually step into a larger role as a much cheaper, controllable option on his rookie deal if Chicago ever decides that moving on from Kmet's veteran salary makes sense for roster flexibility down the line. That's not a knock on Kmet as a player or a person, and it's not a signal that anything's imminent or that Chicago's front office has one foot out the door with him. It's just smart, quiet, forward-thinking roster building using a day 2 pick to develop a long-term answer at a premium scheme position instead of waiting until you're forced into a scramble through free agency to replace a veteran you can no longer comfortably afford under the cap. I also want to give some credit to the rest of what this coaching staff did with its day 2 capital, because Roush wasn't the only under-the-radar swing Ben Johnson clearly had his fingerprints on throughout this entire draft class. Third-round receiver Xavier Thomas out of LSU was viewed by some evaluators as a player who could have realistically gone in the 6th or 7th round based purely on box score production and traditional statistical output. But Chicago bumped him up specifically because of his after-the-catch playmaking ability, his special teams value on both punt and kick coverage units, and some real positional versatility. Reports out of the building have suggested he could even see snaps in the backfield in certain packages, functioning almost like a gadget weapon in specific game plans, and there's a real chance he ends up factoring into the long-term conversation as a change of pace option behind DeAndre Swift down the line. Same story on the defensive side of the ball with 6th-round defensive tackle Jordan Van Den Berg out of Georgia Tech, a player plenty of analysts view as a legitimate steal that far into the draft given his athletic testing numbers and his flashes of disruptive play against SEC-level competition. None of these were splashy names on draft weekend that generated big highlight reel reactions. All three reflect a front office that's clearly building around specific traits and specific scheme fits rather than just chasing name recognition or surface-level box score stats on a spreadsheet. Now, I'll be straight with you about the concerns here too, because that's what separates real analysis from just hyping up every single pick a team makes in July before a single training camp practice has happened. Spending an early 3rd-round selection on a TE3 when the roster still has real legitimate questions at left tackle behind an injured Ozzie Trapelo working his way back from a playoff knee injury and along a defensive front that struggled for real stretches of last season is a defensible pick, not an obviously correct one that everybody should just accept without pushback. If Roush ends up being nothing more than a rotational blocking body who rarely sees the field once the season actually kicks off and the Sunday lights come on, this becomes a pick that's fair to question in hindsight, especially with the alternative options at other positions of genuine need that were reportedly still sitting on the board at that exact spot in the 3rd round. But if Ben Johnson's vision for expanded 12 and 13 personnel usage continues scaling the way it did in year 1 of his tenure, and if Roush's blocking translates the way his college tape strongly and consistently suggests it should against tougher NFL-level competition, this becomes exactly the kind of value pick that quietly wins a draft class 2 or 3 years down the line. Long after everybody stopped talking about the more conventional names taken ahead of him at other positions. Here's my actual take on all of it, put together plainly instead of hedging every sentence. I don't think this was a reach just because the tight end room already had established talent in it heading into the draft. I think this was a targeted scheme fit for a coaching staff that's already shown in a single season as a unified group real conviction about running heavier personnel groupings more often than almost anybody else in the league right now. Roush gives Ben Johnson a true 3rd blocking option who doesn't sacrifice receiving value the moment he's on the field, which is exactly the rare trait that makes the Sky's personnel groupings actually function the way they're drawn up on a whiteboard instead of just tipping the play before the snap and making life easy for a defensive coordinator. If this front four and this offensive line find any real consistency this season, and if Caleb Williams continues developing the way we've talked about repeatedly on this channel throughout the offseason, having a weapon like Roush in the fold gives this offense one more layer of unpredictability that opposing defensive coordinators are going to have to genuinely account for every single week of preparation, not just game plan, around as an afterthought. We're closing in on training camp now, and I promise you we're going to be all over every single practice once pads come on, breaking down exactly how these personnel packages get deployed in real live reps instead of just projecting off college tape like we're doing today from the comfort of July. Sam Roche is exactly the kind of name that could go from an afterthought on draft weekend to a legitimate weekly conversation piece by the time we're deep into the regular season and this offense is humming. And I want you locked in on him from day one of camp so you're not playing catch up on this storyline in October. So here's what I want to know from you. Do you buy into Sam Roush as a legitimate value pick who fits exactly what Ben Johnson wants to build offensively? Or do you think this was a luxury selection at a position the roster simply didn't need to address given everything else still unresolved on this roster? And be honest with me, does this change how you view Cole Kmet's long-term future in Chicago at all, even just a little? Drop your take in the comments, smash that like button if you're excited about what this tight end room could look like this season, and subscribe to Faves for more no-filter Bears news, rumors, and film breakdowns all training camp long. Bear down.